The immediate period right after I buried my wife was a time of immense crushing vulnerability, yet my daughter-in-law decided it was the perfect time to hand me a one-way ticket to a state-run nursing home. I absorbed this shocking, heartless gesture in silence. I did not argue with her, and I did not scream in anger. Instead of confronting the betrayal in that room, I just walked out the back door of the house to escape. Seeking an immediate exit from the property, I got into my neighbor's rusted truck. I sat quietly in the passenger seat and let him drive me away from my neighborhood to an abandoned industrial warehouse located specifically on the edge of town. During the tense drive, he looked at me with a profoundly grim expression on his face. He explicitly instructed me to keep this entire situation between us and strongly warned me not to tell my son about it. Upon arriving at the location, when I saw exactly what they had been carefully hiding behind those heavy steel doors, my physical reaction was instantaneous and my blood ran completely cold. It was in that terrifying moment I finally realized the family I had sacrificed absolutely everything for had been secretly plotting behind my back to completely destroy me. The sheer rawness of my grief was overwhelming, especially since the dirt on my wife Barbara's grave was not even dry yet. The heartbreaking reality was that we had just returned directly from the cemetery. Adding to the physical misery of the day, the Ohio rain had been coming down in a relentless freezing drizzle all morning long. This icy precipitation was entirely unforgiving, soaking right through my formal black suit and chilling me down to my 71-year-old bones, seeking some quiet refuge. I was sitting at my kitchen table, simply staring blankly at a mug of black coffee. That coffee had gone cold hours ago, entirely forgotten in the wake of the funeral. The house around me felt incredibly suffocatingly empty. For 40 wonderful years, the comforting smell of Barbara's baking and the gentle sound of her humming used to fill these very rooms. Now, in her permanent absence, there was only a suffocating silence. This heavy quiet was only broken by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels coming assertively down the hallway toward the kitchen. The person wearing those heels was Natalie, my son's wife. She confidently walked into the kitchen area carrying a glossy, brightly colored brochure in her hands. Despite the obvious grief of the day, she did not ask how I was feeling. Furthermore, she did not offer a comforting hug or provide a warm meal to help me through the trauma. Instead of offering basic sympathy, she simply slid the pamphlet across the smooth wooden surface of the table. She pushed it until it stopped right in front of my resting hands. I looked down at what she had presented to me. The cover of the material read "Sunset Pines" in elegant cursive letters. I knew exactly what that place was the moment I saw the name. It was a notoriously underfunded state-run nursing home situated out on the outskirts of the county. I associated it as a grim place that smelled heavily of bleach, boiled cabbage, and absolute despair. It operated essentially as a warehouse where families unceremoniously dumped their elderly relatives when they no longer wanted to deal with them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who completely underestimated your worth. I slowly looked up from the glossy, brightly colored brochure resting on my kitchen table, my mind intensely struggling to process the sheer suffocating audacity of what was presently happening to me. I am not a weak individual. I am a man who spent 4 grueling, relentless decades building a massive $15 million heavy machinery and equipment leasing empire completely from the dirt up. My massive fleet did not appear overnight. I started my entire journey with nothing more than one single broken-down bulldozer and a deeply rusty toolbox. In those early days, I worked agonizing 60-hour weeks, physically bleeding and sweating in the bitter, freezing cold environments of construction sites. I endured all of that physical torment for one specific reason, just so my son Jason would never have to know what the terrifying grip of poverty truly felt like. Exactly 3 years ago, I made the deeply personal choice to voluntarily step down from my powerful position as Chief Executive Officer, and I completely handed Jason the keys to the entire kingdom. I did this solely because my beloved wife Barbara had just been diagnosed with a sudden, devastatingly aggressive illness. At that critical moment, I desperately wanted to trade all my corporate board meetings for quiet daily hospital visits. I deeply wanted to be by her side constantly, to hold her fragile hand through her pain, to lovingly make her warm soups, and to gently rub her extremely tired feet. I willingly surrendered all my corporate power for pure love, fully trusting my own flesh and blood to safely safeguard the massive financial legacy I had built for our family. Now sitting directly across from me at the kitchen table, Natalie wore a highly practiced, sickly sweet smile that completely lacked any genuine warmth or empathy. She confidently reached out and gently patted my rough, calloused hand, exactly as if I were a confused, helpless toddler. She then spoke to me in an incredibly slow, deeply patronizing tone designed to demean my intelligence. She told me that I really needed to breathe and look at this entire situation logically. She boldly claimed that my mind was actively slipping. To justify this horrific claim, she stated that I forgot to lock the back porch door the previous night. She used this single event to insist that I was rapidly becoming a serious danger to myself. She firmly stated that she and Jason simply could not be there to constantly monitor me 24 hours a day. She coldly reasoned that they had the large business to run. She attempted to frame this cruel eviction by saying they were just trying to keep me safe. She enthusiastically claimed they had found this lovely facility where I would be properly managed by state professionals. Hearing these words, my gut immediately twisted into a tight, incredibly painful knot of disbelief and anger. My mind was absolutely not slipping. The absolute truth was that I had left the porch door unlocked last night simply because I had spent the entire night sitting out on the patio. I had been sitting there looking up at the stars, openly weeping for the wonderful woman I had deeply loved since I was merely 20 years old. I was a man deeply grieving my dead wife, not an old man going senile. But the terrifying reality was that Natalie was deliberately and maliciously twisting my profound grief into a dangerous weapon to legally declare me incompetent. I slowly turned my heavy head to look directly at my son to see his reaction to this betrayal. Jason was currently standing silently by the kitchen window, deliberately and completely avoiding my intense gaze. He was dressed impeccably, wearing a custom-tailored designer suit paired with a heavy gold watch that likely cost significantly more than most people's personal cars. In his hand, he casually held a heavy crystal glass that was filled with expensive $200 scotch. He stood there silently swirling the amber liquid around the glass. During this entire horrific interaction, he did not say a single word to defend me or my sanity. Instead, he cowardly let his wife do all the dirty work of throwing me away. The very boy I had lovingly carried on my shoulders, the exact man I had generously given a thriving $15 million company to, could not even look his own grieving father in the eye while throwing him out of his own cherished home. The supposedly plausible lie they were actively spinning in my kitchen was so incredibly carefully constructed. They desperately wanted to frame this forced eviction as an act of pure familial compassion. They wanted it to look like a necessary, urgent medical intervention for a rapidly declining old man. But the ugly truth was already bleeding heavily through the visible cracks of their theatrical performance. My mind raced back to Barbara's final months. If the family business was truly doing so poorly that they could not afford private at-home care for her exactly as Jason had previously claimed, how on earth could Natalie currently afford the brand new luxury sports utility vehicle that was presently parked out in my driveway? Furthermore, how could Jason possibly afford to casually drink heavily imported expensive scotch on the very day of his own mother's funeral? As these glaring financial inconsistencies slammed into my mind, I felt a dangerous, truly terrifying calm completely wash over my entire being. In that split second, the vulnerable, grieving husband entirely vanished, and the incredibly ruthless businessman who had successfully survived decades of highly cutthroat industry negotiations finally woke up. I instantly knew that if I lost my temper, yelled at them, threw a physical fit, or aggressively demanded answers right then, I would play absolutely perfectly into their sinister narrative. They would undoubtedly use my anger to immediately call the authorities, falsely claim I was having a violent, highly paranoid episode, and subsequently force me into that miserable nursing home by nightfall. Therefore, I did not argue with them at all. I did not shed a single tear of sorrow. Instead, I calmly and deliberately pushed the glossy nursing home brochure right back across the wooden table. I slowly stood up from my chair, carefully adjusting my formal black suit jacket, and confidently walked right past both of them without uttering a single solitary syllable. I could physically feel their intensely confused stares burning deeply into my back as I pushed open the kitchen door and stepped outside into the freezing rain. The shocking cold air hit my lungs like a massive wake-up call. I purposefully walked down the wet driveway, my analytical mind rapidly racing through 1,000 different possible scenarios, desperately trying to figure out exactly how deep this horrific familial betrayal truly went. Just as I finally reached the sidewalk, a heavily rusted Chevy Silverado suddenly pulled up right alongside me. The passenger side window slowly rolled down with a loud mechanical screech. Sitting inside was Gary Dawson. Gary was 69 years old, had been my former lead diesel mechanic, and was an incredibly trusted friend who had reliably worked alongside me in the deep trenches of the industry for 30 solid years. He had formally retired shortly before I did, but he remarkably still lived just 3 houses down the street from me. His weathered face was currently tight, with an intense expression of pure, unfiltered grimness. He completely skipped any pleasantries. He did not offer any empty apologies about the recent funeral. He did not even bother to ask how I was currently holding up emotionally. Instead, he urgently leaned over the truck's center console and looked at me with an intense urgency that literally made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. "Get in the truck." "Vincent," he immediately commanded me, his rough voice barely a whisper above the loud sound of the idling truck engine. He quickly explained that he was hired by a mysterious shell company to do some specific electrical work at an abandoned warehouse out in the city's industrial district last week. He revealed that when he flipped the main breakers and the building's lights finally came on, he saw something extremely important. He firmly stated that I needed to see it for myself right now. He urged me to keep this secret entirely between us and specifically ordered me that whatever I do, I must not tell my son where we are currently going. I immediately opened the heavy passenger door and quickly climbed into the seat. The deeply familiar smell of engine motor oil and old leather instantly grounded my racing thoughts. As Gary aggressively slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tearing rapidly away from the beautiful house I had built for my family, I looked back one final time. I clearly saw Jason nervously watching us from the kitchen window, still tightly clutching his incredibly expensive drink. Jason smugly thought he had completely won. He truly thought he had successfully disposed of the useless old man, but he had foolishly forgotten one incredibly crucial detail. I was the exact man who taught him absolutely everything he knew about business, and I was about to effectively show him exactly what happens when you foolishly underestimate the primary architect of your entire life. The heavy passenger door of the rusted truck slammed shut, with a surprisingly solid, echoing metallic thud that seemed to loudly reverberate deep inside my very chest. Gary efficiently put the old Silverado in drive, and we immediately pulled away from the curb, leaving my beautiful, custom-built house and my treacherous, scheming family rapidly fading away in the rearview mirror. The cold Ohio rain continued to fall relentlessly, in a steady, freezing sheet violently crashing across the glass windshield. The sharp, rhythmic squeak of the worn wiper blades was the absolutely only sound passing between us in the cabin. Gary did not offer any empty, meaningless condolences about Barbara's passing. He did not ask how I was holding up after the emotionally draining funeral, nor did he awkwardly ask what had just happened in my kitchen with Jason and Natalie. He simply kept his rough, heavily calloused hands planted firmly on the steering wheel, his intense eyes fixed straight on the gray, wet road ahead. That was the defining thing about men who had spent their entire adult lives working closely with heavy steel and massive diesel engines. We inherently understood that some profound wounds were simply too deep for mere words. We communicated best in a comfortable, heavy, and profound silence. I wearily leaned my head back against the worn, faded fabric of the passenger seat, closing my eyes for just a fleeting moment to completely process the sheer, terrifying velocity of my reality, rapidly shifting around me. My own flesh and blood son Jason and his extremely greedy wife Natalie had just tried to carelessly discard me like a broken, useless piece of machinery. The sheer agonizing betrayal burned terribly, like highly corrosive acid flowing through my veins, but the steady, comforting rumble of the truck's engine helped me forcefully push the overwhelming grief down into a dark, tightly locked box in the back of my mind. Right now, I knew I could not afford to be a mourning, heartbroken husband or a deeply disappointed, betrayed father. I urgently needed to be a highly calculated businessman, and a successful businessman always carefully evaluates the surrounding terrain before making a single strategic move. I slowly opened my eyes and silently watched the deeply familiar, wealthy, tree-lined suburban streets of my quiet neighborhood gradually give way to the harsh, unforgiving, commercial zones located on the absolute edge of the city. The passing scenery outside the passenger window began to shift incredibly dramatically. We were driving rapidly away from the polished, highly affluent side of town and descending straight into the rusted, entirely forgotten outskirts of the city's decaying industrial district. This was the specific part of Ohio that relentless time and harsh economic shifts had completely left behind in ruin. Abandoned manufacturing plants ominously loomed on the gray horizon like massive, decaying skeletons. Long chain-link fences were wildly overgrown with thick, dying weeds, and the expansive, cracked concrete parking lots were heavily filled with deep, muddy puddles. The gloomy sky above us hung incredibly low and heavy, casting a bleak, depressing, monochromatic light over the deeply decaying factories. I knew this specific area incredibly well. Decades ago, long before I built my massive leasing empire, I actually used to come down to these very same gritty streets to carefully buy cheap scrap metal and heavily used parts for my very first bulldozer. It was incredibly ironic, in a deeply bitter and twisted way, that the exact moment my entire life felt like it was completely falling apart, I was being physically dragged right back to the gritty, unforgiving foundations where I had first started building it from nothing. The heater in Gary's old truck blasted warm, dry air directly against my wet formal suit trousers, but the freezing chill of the day and the betrayal had already settled deep inside my old bones. I looked over at Gary's profile. His jaw was clenched incredibly tight, a visible muscle ticking rhythmically in his weathered cheek. He navigated the terribly pothole-riddled roads with practiced veteran ease, smoothly taking sharp turns down extremely narrow, entirely unmarked access alleys that most ordinary people did not even know existed. We drove past endless rows of forgotten storage units with severely faded peeling paint and heavily rusted security gates. The deeper we drove into the industrial maze, the more completely isolated we became from civilization. There were absolutely no other cars driving on the road, and there were zero pedestrians walking on the heavily cracked sidewalks. We were entirely alone in a vast, silent graveyard of forgotten American industry. Gary finally slowed the heavy truck down the thick tires, crunching loudly over loose, wet gravel and broken glass. We slowly crawled down a very narrow, dark, dead-end street that was heavily flanked by towering, imposing brick walls. At the very end of this isolated alley sat a massive, supposedly entirely abandoned warehouse. Its giant corrugated metal exterior was heavily rusted from years of neglect, and the few high windows positioned near the roof were completely boarded up tightly from the inside. From the outside perspective, it looked exactly like a desolate place that had not seen a single human soul in over 20 years. Gary abruptly threw the truck into park and immediately killed the roaring engine. The sudden jarring absence of the motor's rumble made the tense silence in the cab feel incredibly heavy and suffocating. The freezing rain continued to tap rhythmically against the thin metal roof above our heads. Gary slowly turned his head to face me, his expression visibly harder and more serious than I had ever seen it in 30 years. He took a slow, deep breath, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a heavy set of metal keys. I was officially hired by a mysterious shell company to fix the entire electrical grid in this specific unit. Last week, Gary said, his voice sounding extremely grim and rasping in the quiet confines of the cab. The unknown contractor who hired me paid entirely in untraceable cash and strictly told me to ask absolutely no questions about the job. They specifically said the massive building had been entirely empty for a decade and just needed basic lighting restored for a prospective new tenant. I did not think much of the strange job until I finally got the main power running. When I forcefully flipped the central breakers and the massive overhead lights finally came on, I saw something truly unbelievable. He paused, his story looking directly out the wet windshield at the rusted warehouse door. You critically need to see it for yourself, Vincent. I honestly did not want to burden you with this horrific discovery on the very day of Barbara's funeral, but after seeing Jason's smug face watching from the window back there, I knew we absolutely could not wait another single minute. Keep this entirely between us, Vincent. Do not tell Jason we are here, and absolutely do not let him know that you suspect a single thing about his operation. I nodded slowly, fully absorbing the gravity of his dire warning. I firmly pushed the heavy passenger side truck door open and boldly stepped out into the freezing cold, relentless rain. The biting cold wind viciously bit into my exposed skin, but I hardly noticed the physical discomfort. Gary climbed out from his front driver's side, immediately reaching back into the wet bed of his truck to pull out a very massive, heavy-duty pair of iron bolt cutters. We walked silently side by side toward the towering, rusted, corrugated metal door of the giant warehouse. The ground beneath our boots was dangerously slick with thick mud and old spilled motor oil. Gary confidently stepped up to the incredibly thick, hardened steel padlock that was securing the main latch of the door. He expertly positioned the heavy, unforgiving iron jaws of the bolt cutters completely around the thickest part of the lock, leaned his entire body weight heavily into the long handles, and pressed down as hard as he could. With a sudden, loud, and incredibly sharp snap that echoed sharply and violently down the empty alleyway, the lock finally gave way and clattered heavily onto the wet concrete floor. Gary quickly pulled the broken metal loop free and casually tossed it aside. He tightly grabbed the rusted handle located at the very base of the massive metal door and looked at me one last time, a deeply unspoken warning passing instantly between us. He threw his strong back into the motion, pulling powerfully upward with a loud, strained grunt. The heavy corrugated door violently rolled up along its rusted tracks with a deafening, piercing, metallic screech that genuinely seemed to aggressively shake the entire foundation of the building. The vast interior of the warehouse was completely pitch black for a brief, terrifying second before Gary quickly reached inside and slammed his hand hard against a heavy industrial switch on the wall. A long row of massive industrial halogen lights immediately flickered overhead, buzzing incredibly loudly as they rapidly flooded the enormous cavernous space with a harsh, entirely blinding, white light. I cautiously stepped forward into the threshold, blinking repeatedly against the sudden intense brightness. When my old eyes finally adjusted to the harsh glare, and I clearly saw exactly what they had been secretly hiding inside that massive concrete vault, my breath caught painfully in my throat, and my jaw dropped completely open in absolute, unadulterated shock. Sitting quietly inside the massive, supposedly empty warehouse was a literal, undeniable mountain of heavy machinery. Lined up in absolutely perfect, gleaming, meticulously organized rows were 12 incredibly massive Caterpillar excavators and heavy lifting cranes. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the parked equipment made the enormous, cavernous building feel suffocatingly small and cramped. I stood entirely frozen in the doorway, my breathing becoming incredibly shallow and uneven, completely unable to mentally process the devastating sight directly before my eyes. These were absolutely not just any random machines bought off an auction lot. They were undeniably my machines. I instantly recognized the highly specific custom modifications I had personally requested from the original manufacturer many years ago. I clearly recognized the heavily reinforced hydraulic arms and the highly custom track treads that were explicitly designed to survive the harsh, freezing Ohio winters. I had personally spent 40 grueling years aggressively sacrificing my physical body and my mental peace of mind to carefully purchase every single piece of that highly lucrative $15 million fleet. I built an entire commercial empire with those magnificent steel giants, and to see them locked away in secret was a revelation that changed everything. As I stood completely mesmerized and stared intensely at the bright yellow metal illuminated so clearly by the harsh overhead halogen lights, my racing mind, forcefully and painfully, dragged me right back to exactly 3 months ago. I vividly remembered the exact scene. I was sitting quietly in our dimly lit living room, gently holding Barbara's incredibly fragile thin hand as she peacefully slept through her immense pain. The quiet atmosphere was shattered when Jason had suddenly walked through the heavy front door, looking completely and utterly defeated in his posture. He heavily collapsed onto the plush sofa directly across from me, dramatically burying his face deep in his hands, and immediately began to cry hysterically. It was a theatrical performance so incredibly convincing, so seemingly full of genuine despair, that I swallowed absolutely every single word he said, without a moment of hesitation or doubt. Jason sobbed and told me that the entire commercial construction market had suddenly suffered a catastrophic, unprecedented crash. He aggressively swore to me that our biggest, most reliable contractors had unexpectedly defaulted on their massive multi-million-dollar project payments, effectively leaving our once thriving company completely drowning in insurmountable debt. He looked me dead in the eye, large tears streaming rapidly down his pale cheeks, and solemnly told me the corporate bank had aggressively called in all our commercial loans all at once. According to his incredibly tragic, well-rehearsed story, the family business was entirely and hopelessly bankrupt, and the bank had already sent ruthless repo teams to immediately seize our entire heavy machinery fleet. I clearly remembered the crushing, suffocating weight of that specific moment bearing down on my shoulders. I felt like an absolute, miserable failure as a father and a provider. I genuinely thought the massive financial legacy I had tirelessly built for decades to protect my family had completely crumbled to useless dust directly under his watch. But the absolute most devastating, heart-wrenching blow of all was exactly what he said next. Jason loudly sobbed and told me that precisely because the company accounts were legally frozen by the banks, he was completely and utterly broke. Because of this supposed catastrophic financial ruin, he looked at his dying mother and told me we could no longer afford to pay for Barbara's premium at-home medical care. He told me with fake agony in his voice that we had to immediately cut back on her basic comfort, dismiss her specialized private nurses, and severely reduce her expensive pain management therapies. For months, I had agonizingly watched my dying wife quietly suffer through her final, painful days with incredibly substandard care, simply because I truly believed my son was financially ruined and was doing his absolute desperate best to keep us afloat. But standing there right now, in the freezing cold, deeply isolated warehouse, the thick, heavy fog of my profound grief finally began to lift, and the small, glaring inconsistencies that I had previously and willfully ignored suddenly roared to vivid, undeniable life. I clearly remembered the exact afternoon Jason had delivered that heartbreaking, devastating news to me in the living room. While he was sitting on my sofa, loudly crying about total bankruptcy and completely empty bank accounts, he had nervously adjusted his crisp shirt cuff. When the tailored sleeve pulled back slightly, I saw the unmistakable, brilliant gleam of a brand-new Rolex Submariner resting heavily on his wrist. It was a highly exclusive luxury watch that easily cost upward of $20,000. Later that very same evening, I had looked out the kitchen window into the dark and watched Natalie pull directly into my driveway to pick him up. She was proudly driving a brand-new, custom-ordered, gleaming white Range Rover that still had the temporary paper dealer plates securely attached to the back. I vividly remembered feeling a sharp, deeply uneasy twist in my gut at that exact moment. The disturbing questions had plagued my mind. How on earth could a man whose entire company had just been aggressively seized by the bank instantly afford a massive luxury timepiece? How could a woman whose husband was supposedly completely penniless and drowning in debt be casually driving a brand new vehicle that cost significantly more than a small suburban house? When I had gently asked Jason about these incredibly lavish, highly suspicious purchases, he quickly and defensively brushed it off. He smoothly lied and told me the expensive watch was actually just a cheap, meaningless imitation that a wealthy friend had given him out of pity, and he claimed that Natalie was simply test driving a temporary lease vehicle just to keep up corporate appearances during the bankruptcy proceedings. I had desperately wanted to believe him with all my heart. I was a highly vulnerable father who was absolutely terrified of losing his dying wife, deeply desperate to maintain any semblance of family peace, so I forced myself to blindly accept his incredibly flimsy excuses. I had intentionally silenced my own sharp business instincts, because the horrifying alternative, that my own son was robbing me while his mother died, was simply too monstrous for my grieving mind to comprehend. Now thoroughly bathed in the blinding, harsh halogen light of the massive hidden warehouse, the monstrous, undeniable truth was finally staring me right in the face, completely shattering any remaining illusions. I walked slowly and methodically toward the nearest massive Caterpillar excavator parked in the immaculate row. My heavy leather boots dragged audibly against the cold, stained concrete floor with every deliberate step. I reached out with a trembling arm and pressed my bare, calloused hand directly against the freezing cold, incredibly heavy solid steel of the giant machine. I slowly walked around to the side of the massive elevated driver cabin, and that is exactly when I noticed the specific, horrifying detail that completely shattered any lingering shred of doubt in my mind. The heavy equipment had absolutely not been repossessed by any corporate bank. It had certainly not been legally seized by aggressive creditors to pay off bad commercial debts. The massive machines had been entirely and newly painted with fresh, bright yellow coats. The deeply familiar proud logo of Gallagher Construction, the exact logo I had personally designed myself over 40 years ago at my kitchen table, had been completely intentionally sandblasted off the metal and heavily painted over. In its place, freshly stenciled in incredibly sharp, bold, jet-black letters straight across the bright yellow paint, was a completely different corporate company name. It clearly read NG Holdings. Natalie Gallagher. The absolute realization hit my chest with the crushing, unstoppable force of a speeding freight train, violently knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. The commercial construction market had never actually crashed. The corporate banks had never once called in our massive commercial loans. The incredibly successful company had never gone bankrupt at all. It was all a highly elaborate, meticulously planned, and profoundly sinister lie designed to blind me. My own flesh and blood son and his incredibly greedy, highly manipulative wife had actively orchestrated a massive fraudulent criminal scheme to quietly and legally steal the entire $15 million fleet right out from under me. They had secretly utilizing complex paperwork transferred my entire life's work into a hidden dummy shell company registered entirely under her name, actively hiding the massive physical assets in this deeply forgotten, abandoned corner of the industrial city. They had brilliantly fabricated a completely fake financial crisis, strictly to deceive my grieving mind, to effectively bypass my founder's oversight, and to ruthlessly seize total, undisputed control of the massive empire I built with my own bare hands. And the absolute most unforgivable, truly sickening crime of all this was not the massive theft of the steel machinery itself. It was the horrifying realization that they had intentionally hoarded millions of dollars in stolen liquid assets while looking me dead in the eye and telling me there was absolutely no money to ease the agonizing, relentless pain of my dying wife. They deliberately let Barbara suffer through her final months on Earth, denying her critical care. Strictly so, they could safely protect their stolen wealth and continuously fund their lavish, disgusting, highly materialistic lifestyle without drawing suspicion. A terrifying, absolute, and freezing calm suddenly began to wash over my entire mind, neutralizing every other emotion. The deep sorrow and the heavy, suffocating grief that had securely anchored me to the ground for the past 3 months simply evaporated into thin air, entirely vanishing from my system. In its place, a remarkably cold, highly calculated, and totally relentless rage took deep, permanent root directly inside my soul. I slowly turned away from the stolen, repainted excavator and looked back across the massive space at Gary. He was standing completely still near the main warehouse entrance, silently watching me mentally process the devastating, world-altering reality with a deep look of pure, shared anger etched into his weathered features. He knew exactly what this horrible discovery meant. He fully knew the profound, unforgivable kind of betrayal we had just unearthed together in this dark place. Gary walked slowly over to me, his heavy work boots echoing incredibly loudly in the vast, otherwise entirely empty space. He gently placed a remarkably steady, comforting hand on my shoulder, giving it a very firm, highly supportive squeeze. He did not need to say a single word to comfort my broken heart. Instead, his expression hardened, and he raised his arm, pointing directly toward the far darkest corner of the expansive warehouse. Sitting quietly and ominously in the deep shadows of the building was a locked, highly secure modular office unit. Its small windows were heavily covered with thick, welded metal grates, and a very heavy reinforced steel security door entirely blocked the main entrance. Gary looked me dead in the eye, the silence of the warehouse making his voice sound incredibly low and profoundly serious. "The stolen machines are just the surface here, Vincent," he warned me, confirming my darkest suspicions. He firmly nodded his head toward the highly isolated, heavily fortified room in the corner. "The real, undeniable poison is locked away securely in there." I stared fixedly at the locked modular office, a box of cheap, stained drywall and reinforced metal grates sitting like an ugly, malignant tumor in the center of the warehouse floor. Gary was absolutely right. The stolen, repainted machinery was merely the heavy lifting, the visible tip of an iceberg of greed. The real devastating paper trail that had systematically slaughtered my life's legacy was locked securely inside that cramped, windowless room. I did not waste a single second of time looking for a spare key or asking Gary how to expertly pick the lock. The heavy, suffocating sorrow that had been weighing down my chest for months was suddenly gone, completely replaced by a cold, surgical precision. I was no longer a grieving, broken widower, helplessly bracing for a state-run nursing home. In that moment, I was once again the founder of Gallagher Construction, a man who had built towers hunting a scavenging rat in my own house. I slipped out of my dark formal suit jacket, folded it tightly around the heavy industrial iron wrench I had grabbed from the bed of Gary's truck, and walked with determined, heavy strides up to the modular office. Bypassing the reinforced heavy-duty steel door, I stopped directly in front of the only window on the side of the unit. I swung the padded wrench in a short, brutal, and controlled arc. The reinforced safety glass shattered inward, with a satisfying, sharp crunch, raining down shards onto the floor inside. I reached through the jagged, dangerous opening, feeling a glass shard tear through my dress shirt and slice across my forearm, but I did not care. The physical pain was nothing compared to the burning fire of the truth I was about to expose. I unlocked the simple latch, shoved the window frame open with a grunt of exertion, and hoisted my 71-year-old body over the ledge, landing heavily on the cheap, worn carpet inside the dark office. The space was filled with the stale, lingering smell of cheap, burned coffee and industrial dust. Gary stood silently on watch outside, leaning against a rusted, load-bearing pillar in the warehouse. He knew instinctively that I needed to do this part entirely alone to face the demons of my own creation without an audience. The office was small, cramped, and windowless on 3 sides, creating an atmosphere of claustrophobic secrecy. It felt eerily similar to the temporary, makeshift job site trailers I used to set up decades ago when we were digging the foundations for the first commercial skyscrapers in the city. I walked over to the cheap laminate desk dominating the center of the room. On top of it sat a dual-monitor computer setup, the screens dark, merely pulsing, with a slow, rhythmic standby light that felt like a heartbeat. I moved the mouse and the monitors flared to life, casting a harsh, artificial blue glow across the cramped, dusty room. My son had always been defined by his arrogance. He had not bothered to put a single password on the desktop, believing himself so untouchable, so completely invincible, that he felt comfortable hiding his massive theft in a forgotten warehouse that no one on earth was supposed to find. I pulled out the rolling chair and sat down, my body aching, but my mind alert. My eyes immediately began to scan the digital desktop. It was littered with chaotic spreadsheets, banking portals, and dozens of PDF documents, a digital graveyard of my life's work. I clicked open the main accounting folder, my hands steady now. I found the formal articles of incorporation for a company called NG Holdings, or Natalie Gallagher Holdings. The digital documents showed it was established exactly 8 months ago. That was the precise window of time when Jason started complaining loudly about phantom supply chain issues and delayed payments from our biggest, most loyal clients. He had been intentionally creating the problem, meticulously laying the groundwork for his fake bankruptcy, long before he brought his crocodile tears into my living room. I clicked through the asset transfer sheets and my stomach turned at the sheer scale of the forgery. They had forged my personal digital signature on over 40 separate equipment release forms. They legally transferred the ownership of bulldozers, cranes, and flatbed trucks from Gallagher Construction to Natalie's shell company for the laughable, insulting sum of $1 per machine. They essentially sold my entire $15 million fleet to themselves for the price of a cheap cup of convenience store coffee. I pulled a blank flash drive from my pocket, plugged it into the computer tower, and began copying every single file, email, and fraudulent bank statement I could find. I was gathering the ammunition I needed to bury them. While the digital progress bar slowly filled, copying gigabytes of their stolen data, I turned my focused attention to a row of gray dented metal filing cabinets pushed against the back wall. The top 2 drawers were secured with a heavy sliding lock bar. I did not hesitate. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the desk drawer, wedged it behind the locking mechanism, and threw my entire body weight backward in a sudden, violent yank. The cheap metal groaned, bent, and snapped with a loud, satisfying pop, the locking bar clattering noisily to the floor. I pulled the top drawer open. The scent of fresh, crisp paper wafted up, a strange contrast to the decay of the warehouse. It was packed tight with manila folders, each one meticulously and arrogantly labeled with Natalie's neat, looping handwriting. They were incredibly organized in their thievery, proud of their work. I started pulling folders out, tossing them carelessly onto the desk under the harsh blue light of the monitors. I found title deeds, insurance policies taken out on my stolen equipment, and glossy brochures for offshore tax havens. Then my hands brushed against a thick, weathered folder near the very back of the drawer. The label read, Gallagher Liquidation, in stark, cold black ink. I pulled it out and flipped it open, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat of fury. Inside was a comprehensive, step-by-step timeline of their entire plan to dismantle my life. There were draft documents preparing to sell the prime commercial lot, where my main headquarters sat, the foundation of my entire career. There were emails negotiating massive illegal cash payouts for the land under my business, effectively selling the ground I stood on. But the most sickening, truly stomach-turning part was a section dedicated entirely to me. I found printed emails between Natalie and the corrupt administrator of Sunset Pines, the very nursing home she had tried to send me to just 2 hours ago. They had been discussing my forced admission for weeks, like scheduling a drop-off for unwanted furniture. They paid a substantial, non-refundable retainer fee to secure a locked room in the memory care ward where I would have been forgotten. They planned to drug me, declare me a danger to society, and trap me where I would have zero access to a phone, a lawyer, or the truth. They had mapped out my entire legal destruction down to the very last pathetic dollar. I felt a cold, sharp sweat break out across my forehead, the room suddenly feeling even smaller, even more suffocating. I had always known that the world of business was a ruthless, cutthroat game, but seeing my own son architect my imprisonment was a kind of visceral, intimate violence I had never imagined possible. I closed the liquidation folder, my breathing growing ragged and heavy in the small, stifling space. I reached back into the filing cabinet to see if there was anything else that could explain the absolute hollow darkness I had discovered in my son's heart. My fingers scraped against the bottom of the drawer, hitting something hard. Beneath all the neatly organized financial records tucked away, as if it were a minor afterthought, was another folder. This one was different, physically different. It was bright, harsh, and vivid red, screaming for attention. I pulled it out slowly, with a hesitation I hadn't felt for the financial documents. The thick cardboard felt unnaturally heavy, almost vibrating in my hands. I held it up to the harsh light of the computer monitors to read the label. My heart stopped, completely skipping a beat that left me dizzy. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely, completely gone, leaving me gasping. The label, written in Jason's distinctive, familiar handwriting, this time simply read, Medical Barbara. For a long, agonizing, frozen second, I just stared blankly at the sharp, indifferent black ink. Barbara, my wife, the brilliant, loving, compassionate woman we had just buried in the freezing Ohio rain. The woman whose specialized, life-saving medical care Jason had claimed we could no longer afford because the business had tragically gone bankrupt. The business that I now knew for an absolute cold fact was never bankrupt at all. I stared at the red cardboard, a terrifying, soul-crushing realization beginning to claw its way up my throat like bile. Why would Jason keep a separate, hidden medical file on his own mother in a secret, heavily guarded warehouse dedicated entirely to corporate fraud and massive money laundering operations? What possible sinister or inhuman reason could there be to deliberately lock her confidential private medical records away with stolen asset deeds and offshore banking details? A thick, suffocating dread washed over me, chilling me far deeper, far more intensely than the relentless freezing rain outside had ever managed to do. My hand began to shake uncontrollably, a tremor I couldn't suppress as I finally rested my trembling fingers right on the jagged, sharp edge of the bright red cover. I pulled the thick red cardboard folder out of the heavy metal drawer, and my heart hammering, a chaotic, frantic rhythm against my ribs, echoing in my ears. The sharp black ink spelling my late wife's name seemed to burn into my vision, a brand of betrayal. Every primal instinct in my body screamed at me to rip it open right there, to uncover whatever twisted, hidden secret my son was keeping about his own mother, regardless of the consequences. But as my thumb traced the edge of the cover, the computer monitor on the desk behind me emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. The green progress bar for the massive critical file transfer had just reached 50%. I forced myself to take a deep, stabilizing, ragged breath, pulling my desperate focus away from the red folder with supreme effort. I was a man who had spent 40 years building a corporate empire from the dirt, and I knew with cold certainty that if I let my raw, unfiltered emotions take over right now, I would make a catastrophic, irreversible mistake that could cost me my freedom and my revenge. I gently placed the red folder face down on the corner of the desk, treating it like a highly volatile, unexploded bomb that could annihilate me if I mishandled it. I needed to finish securing the financial evidence first to ensure they had no way to wiggle out of the trap. I turned my full, unwavering attention back to the glowing blue screen, clicking open the master ledger files that Jason had so arrogantly, so carelessly left completely unencrypted. What I found meticulously documented inside those complex digital spreadsheets was an absolute undisputed masterclass in corporate theft, a blueprint of his moral decay. My son and his wife had not just stolen my $15 million fleet, they had orchestrated a systematic, devastatingly calculated financial assassination of Gallagher Construction. I opened the quarterly valuation reports and felt my blood run ice cold, the chill spreading to my fingertips. Jason had intentionally and artificially deflated the total real-world value of our entire company to hide the assets. He had filed fraudulent depreciation schedules claiming that our high-end, heavy-lifting cranes and Caterpillar excavators were severely damaged, obsolete, and practically worthless pieces of rusted scrap metal. By completely fabricating a catastrophic, non-existent loss of asset value, he created the perfect, flawless illusion of a failing, dying business. But the sheer mind-boggling audacity of his crime went much, much deeper than merely lying on a balance sheet. I opened a subfolder labeled Asset Liquidation and found over 40 separate, detailed equipment release forms. At the bottom of every single page was my exact pixel-perfect digital signature. Jason had perfectly copied the electronic authorization stamp that I only used for emergency vendor approvals when I was out of the country on business trips. With a few clicks of a mouse, my own flesh and blood son had legally authorized the transfer of my entire life's work. He had signed over every single bulldozer, flatbed truck, and industrial crane to Natalie's newly formed dummy shell company. And the official sale price listed on the forged transfer deeds was exactly one single insulting dollar per machine. They had literally handed themselves $15 million worth of heavy operational machinery for less than the cost of a cheap, greasy diner breakfast. The cold, mechanical, and soulless cruelty of his paperwork was absolutely staggering to behold. I sent the entire batch of forged transfer deeds to the small, whirring laser printer sitting on the edge of the desk. The machine began to hum and click rhythmically, spitting out page after page of undeniable, legally binding and damning proof of their grand, systematic larceny. While the printer churned out the physical evidence of their property theft, I dug even deeper into the banking portals saved on the desktop browser. Jason had not just stolen the physical machines. He had drained the lifeblood of the company, leaving the carcass for me to find. I found the routed complex transaction histories for our main corporate accounts. Over the past 3 years, whenever our biggest commercial clients paid their massive project invoices, Jason did not deposit the funds into the legitimate operating accounts. Instead, he routed the payments through a complex, dizzying web of dummy vendors and entirely fake subcontracting invoices. He was paying phantom, non-existent companies for materials we never received and services we never used. I followed the digital paper trail as it bounced from Ohio to Delaware and finally to a private, high-yield offshore account located in the sunny, distant Bahamas. I clicked on the final account summary, and the bright, sterile white numbers on the screen practically blinded me in the dim office. Sitting in that hidden, secure offshore account, quietly accumulating interest under Natalie's maiden name, was precisely $8,400,000 in stolen liquid cash. That was my money. That was the security net I had spent decades building brick by brick so my family would never have to experience the suffocating, terrifying grip of poverty. They had drained my hard-earned accounts, hoarded over $8 million in untraceable cash, and then looked me dead in the eyes while I was sitting next to my dying wife's bed to tell me we were completely, utterly broke. They watched me agonize over the daily crushing cost of Barbara's pain medications, while they were sitting comfortably on a mountain of stolen millions. The sheer magnitude of their greed, their selfishness, and their utter lack of humanity was physically, violently nauseating. I highlighted the entire directory of offshore banking statements, routing numbers and fake vendor invoices, dragging them all onto my encrypted flash drive with a sense of grim finality. The tension in the small windowless office rose with every passing ticking second. I could hear the faint, muffled, and melancholic sound of the freezing rain battering incessantly against the corrugated metal roof of the massive warehouse outside. Gary was out there in the dark, standing guard, implicitly trusting me to find the absolute truth, whatever it might be. I watched the green progress bar on the computer screen inch closer and closer to 100%, holding my breath. The laser printer finally stopped its rhythmic mechanical humming, spitting out the very last page of the forged asset transfer deeds. I gathered the thick, warm stack of freshly printed papers and stuffed them safely, securely inside my jacket pocket. I safely ejected the flash drive and closed my fist tightly, firmly around it, feeling the small device hold the weight of their destruction. I finally had the undeniable financial truth securely in my possession. I had the concrete, irrefutable evidence required to put both my son and my greedy, manipulative daughter-in-law in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, grand larceny, and gross corporate negligence. Their beautiful sun-drenched Hawaiian retirement plan was effectively dead and buried just like the wife they had betrayed. The computer screen returned to its quiet, glowing blue desktop, the light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The mechanical, monotonous whir of the hard drive faded into the background, leaving the small modular office trapped in a heavy, suffocating silence. The business investigation was officially, decisively over. I had successfully saved the legacy, at least on paper. But there was still one more thing resting on the corner of the desk, waiting for me. I slowly turned my head, my neck feeling stiff, and stared at the bright, accusatory red cardboard folder sitting exactly where I had left it. The financial ruin of my company was a devastating, heavy blow to my pride, but the money was ultimately just numbers on a screen, and numbers can be erased. Money could be recovered eventually. Machinery could be repurchased with time. Contracts could be renegotiated with effort. But the folder labeled Medical Barbara held something entirely, sacredly different. It held the fragile, precious, and irreplaceable memory of the woman I had loved more than my own, breathing my own life. My hands began to tremble once again as I reached across the cheap, scarred laminate desk. The rough cardboard felt unnaturally, disturbingly heavy against my fingertips, as if it contained a massive, dangerous physical weight that was about to completely crush my soul into pieces. I took one final long, deep, and shaky breath, swallowed the thick, painful, jagged lump forming in my throat, and carefully flipped the bright red cover open, finally bracing my racing, terrified heart for the absolute worst, most monstrous truth a father could ever possibly discover about his own child. The top page inside the red folder was printed on the thick, formal, and authoritative letterhead of an elite oncology center located just outside the state. My eyes scanned the crisp, cold, black text, and with every sentence I read, the air in the cramped, airless office grew thinner, colder, and harder to breathe. The letter confirmed with devastating clarity that my wife Barbara had been officially accepted into a highly successful experimental immunotherapy trial exactly 4 months ago. The medical notes indicated the treatment had a remarkable high success rate for her specific aggressive illness, offering a genuine fighting chance at remission. The total upfront out-of-pocket cost was $150,000. Stapled directly coldly beneath the acceptance letter was a standardized hospital waiver form. My eyes dropped to the signature line, feeling the blood drain from my face. It was signed, clearly and legibly, by Jason. He held Barbara's temporary medical proxy while I was overseas on a contract last year. Next to his signature was a handwritten, careless note explaining his decision to decline the life-saving treatment. The note read, "Treatment declined due to complete lack of available corporate and personal funds." I stared at that single, devastating, hateful sentence, my vision blurring at the edges. My brain instantly, painfully connected the timeline. The exact date stamped on the refusal form was identical to the date printed on the dealership receipt for Natalie's brand-new luxury Range Rover. They had let my wife suffer and die because paying for her medical treatment meant dipping into their stolen millions. They traded her life, her precious remaining time, for a luxury vehicle. I did not break down. I did not shed any tears today. Instead, a terrifying, absolute, and frozen calm washed over every single nerve in my body, numbing the pain. I closed the red folder, picked up the printed financial evidence, and walked out of the modular office, my movements fluid and deadened. Gary was standing in the shadows, waiting, watching my expression harden into cold, unyielding stone. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with a voice I hardly recognized as my own, a voice stripped of all humanity. "Take me to Thomas Reed." "Oh, We immediately left the rusting machines sitting in the harsh halogen glare and drove straight out of the forgotten, decaying industrial district, heading directly and purposefully into the bustling heart of downtown. The atmosphere inside Gary's truck had completely shifted. The heavy, melancholic silence of grief had been entirely replaced by the cold, electric tension of a looming, catastrophic war. We navigated away from the cracked concrete and dying weeds, moving toward the towering glass skyscrapers that housed the city's most ruthless corporate predators. The man we were going to see, Thomas Reed, was absolutely not the kind of soft-spoken, agreeable lawyer who handled peaceful, mediated contract disputes or polite, mundane family estate planning. He was an incredibly ruthless, highly feared corporate litigator widely known throughout the state as an absolute unyielding bulldog in the courtroom. I had personally hired him twice over the last 20 years to systematically and completely dismantle rival contracting firms that had foolishly tried to undercut Gallagher Construction. Thomas was exorbitantly expensive and exceptionally aggressive qualities, which made him the exact perfect weapon I currently needed to entirely destroy my own son. I did not need a therapist or a family counselor. I needed a legal executioner who would not hesitate to draw blood. We pulled up to the pristine, towering glass building, leaving Gary's heavily rusted truck with the valet, and rode the silent, high-speed elevator up to the top-floor executive suites. Upon exiting the elevator, we completely bypassed the shocked receptionist, sitting at the marble front desk, marching aggressively straight through the heavy glass doors of his private corner suite. Thomas was standing quietly by his expansive floor-to-ceiling window, casually sipping a dark espresso and meticulously reviewing a thick legal brief in the morning light. Hearing our heavy, uninvited footsteps, he slowly turned around, his sharp, calculating gray eyes immediately registering the intensely grim, unsmiling expressions plastered on our faces. Without offering a single formal greeting or useless pleasantry, I walked directly over to his massive, polished mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. I reached into my jacket, lifted the thick, heavy stack of freshly printed forged transfer deeds, the undeniable offshore banking statements, and finally, the damning bright red medical folder, and forcefully dumped them right in the absolute center of his pristine workspace. The massive pile of stolen, horrifying secrets landed on the wood with a heavy, resonating thud that seemed to momentarily suck the air right out of the elegant room. Thomas's eyes darted to the chaotic pile. He slowly, deliberately set his delicate espresso cup down on a coaster, leaning his tall frame forward to closely inspect the scattered documents. I stood rigidly on the opposite side of the mahogany desk, my posture entirely unyielding and completely devoid of any remaining warmth. I looked my ruthless lawyer dead in the eye and plainly told him I needed him to immediately initiate the most aggressive, devastating corporate warfare he had ever waged in his entire career. My voice did not shake as I told him the horrifying truth: my own son and his wife had secretly stolen my entire $15 million fleet, illegally drained over $8 million to a hidden Bahamian account, and indirectly maliciously murdered my dying wife just to protect their stolen fortune. Thomas did not gasp in shock, nor did he offer any useless, patronizing, emotional platitudes about how terribly sorry he was for my unimaginable familial loss. He was a true professional who understood that grief was irrelevant in the face of legal annihilation. He calmly reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out his expensive reading glasses, sat down heavily in his high-backed leather chair, and immediately began to rapidly, silently process the mountain of paperwork. The tense, suffocating silence in the upscale, luxurious office was broken absolutely only by the sharp, rhythmic sound of thick paper pages flipping under his expert fingers. Gary and I stood silently in front of the desk like ancient, immovable stone statues, patiently waiting for the master litigator's legal assessment to officially begin. After 10 agonizing, quiet minutes of intense scrutiny, Thomas finally looked up, his sharp gray eyes unusually wide with a very rare mixture of genuine professional shock and a deeply predatory, calculating excitement. He aggressively slapped a large hand flat against the thick stack of forged asset liquidation forms I had printed at the warehouse. "This is absolutely not just a simple, localized case of familial embezzlement, Vincent," he said, his voice clipped, authoritative, and completely intensely focused on the battle ahead. He firmly explained that this was a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar syndicate-level crime that crossed numerous jurisdictions. Thomas emphatically stated that Jason and Natalie have committed massive, undeniable wire fraud by purposefully routing your stolen corporate funds directly across international borders into that hidden Bahamian account. He continued to outline their doom, explaining that by intentionally and falsely deflating the company valuation and explicitly forging your digital signature on these specific transfer deeds, they are officially looking at consecutive, devastating counts of grand larceny, severe corporate malfeasance, and gross fiduciary negligence. He then slowly reached out and picked up the bright red medical folder, shaking his head in absolute unfiltered disgust at the inhumanity it contained. He looked me in the eye and stated that while the medical waiver Jason signed denying Barbara's treatment might technically barely fall within his legal proxy rights on paper, combining that cruel refusal with the simultaneous massive theft of company assets paints a truly horrifying, legally damning picture of severe elder abuse and criminal deprivation. Thomas leaned back, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. If we hand this comprehensive mountain of evidence directly over to a federal prosecutor, they will absolutely not just face simple civil penalties or basic fines. He promised me they will be looking at decades locked away in a high-security federal penitentiary. The mention of federal prison should have brought me a sense of peace, but it was simply not enough to quench the freezing rage burning inside my chest. I leaned heavily over the massive mahogany desk, planting both of my bare hands firmly and aggressively onto the highly polished wood invading Thomas's space. I looked directly into his calculating eyes and told him I did absolutely not just want them sitting in a federal prison cell. I told him with a voice as cold as absolute zero that I wanted to systematically strip them of every single cent they possessed, every hidden asset they owned, and absolutely every ounce of their arrogant, unearned dignity long before the federal agents ever even put them in steel handcuffs. I wanted Jason and Natalie to fully consciously realize their entire beautiful, wealthy world was completely burning down to ash while they were helplessly trapped inside it, unable to escape the flames of their own making. Thomas Reed slowly smiled, a sharp, incredibly dangerous curving of his lips that clearly signaled to everyone in the room he was fully enthusiastically prepared to go to absolute war on my behalf. He briskly pulled a fresh yellow legal pad toward him across the desk and ceremoniously uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen entirely ready to meticulously map out their total financial and personal destruction. The atmosphere in the room shifted to one of pure tactical retaliation. But just as Thomas confidently began to organize the loose printed emails I had recovered from Jason's deeply hidden liquidation folder, his professional expression suddenly and violently shifted. The confident, highly predatory grin completely vanished from his face in a split second, rapidly replaced by a look of sudden, intense, and urgent tension. He quickly reached into the pile and pulled a single, slightly crumpled email printout directly from the bottom of the stack, holding it close to his face. He read the text twice, his sharp gray eyes darting frantically across the printed words, his jaw clenching tight. Without a word of warning, he aggressively slammed the piece of paper down hard on the mahogany desk and stood up abruptly, pointing a stiff accusatory finger directly at the printed words. "Vincent, we have a massive immediate problem," Thomas warned, his normally composed voice now tight with genuine unfiltered alarm. He urgently explained that while I came to him today to carefully plan a strategic, devastating counterstrike, my son is actually moving much, much faster than we ever anticipated. I looked down at the alarming paper, then back up at Thomas, my heart pounding intensely, demanding to know exactly what he was talking about. Thomas quickly picked up the incriminating document and shoved it aggressively across the polished desk right toward me. He pointed to the header and revealed that this is a highly confidential email chain between Natalie, and a highly corrupt, completely unethical private psychiatrist who actively operates on the very edge of the state medical board's regulations. According to this hidden correspondence, Jason and Natalie secretly paid this doctor a massive untraceable cash retainer to explicitly conduct an emergency forced psychiatric evaluation directly at my home. Thomas urgently tapped the specific date stamped clearly at the very top of the printed page. They have officially hired this highly corrupt doctor to legally evaluate you this coming Friday. Vincent, he stated, his eyes wide. That is terrifyingly less than 48 hours from right now. Thomas heavily leaned over the desk, ensuring I understood the severe gravity of the threat. He explicitly warned me that they are not just planning to slowly, quietly phase you out of the family business anymore, as we originally thought. They are aggressively moving to legally declare you entirely medically incompetent, to forcefully seize immediate power of attorney over your entire life, and to physically forcefully commit you to that horrific state-run nursing home by the absolute end of this very week. Thomas looked me dead in the eye, the crushing existential gravity of the dire situation hanging incredibly heavy in the quiet room. They are aggressively coming for your house, Vincent, and they are ruthlessly coming for your absolute fundamental freedom. I slowly sat back in the deep plush leather chair, letting the sheer, terrifying weight of Thomas Reed's urgent words fully settle over me in the quiet office. They were actively and aggressively coming for my absolute fundamental freedom. The harsh reality of what my own flesh and blood was attempting to do to me should have completely crushed my spirit and broken my heart into pieces, but the suffocating grief of the past 3 months had been completely and entirely burned away by the cold, unyielding fire of primal survival. Jason and Natalie truly deeply believed they had already won this silent war. They arrogantly thought they had successfully cornered a fragile, senile old man who was far too distracted by his intense mourning to ever notice the sharp knife slowly sliding deep into his back. I looked down at the crumpled printed email chain resting ominously on the mahogany desk. They had actually bribed a highly corrupt medical professional to brazenly walk right into my own living room this coming Friday, violently drug me into a chemical stupor, and physically drag me out of my own cherished home entirely under the false guise of an emergency psychiatric hold. It was an incredibly flawless, utterly merciless execution of both corporate and personal theft. But Jason had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation when he arrogantly decided to steal the massive company I built from the ground up. He foolishly assumed he knew absolutely everything about the deep hidden foundation of my empire. He did not. Thomas leaned back in his own executive chair, thoughtfully rubbing his chin as he looked intensely at the massive, damning pile of forged transfer deeds. He shook his head slowly, a complex gesture of both begrudging professional respect for the intricate crime and deep visceral disgust for the perpetrators. Your son has orchestrated a very impressive, highly sophisticated financial illusion, Vincent Thomas said quietly, his analytical mind rapidly deconstructing the fraud. He explicitly detailed how by perfectly forging your digital signature on these highly specific asset liquidation forms, Jason had successfully transferred the legal documented ownership of your entire heavy machinery fleet directly into his wife's newly created shell company. Thomas pointed at the forged papers and explained that entirely on paper, it looks exactly like a completely legitimate standard corporate restructuring maneuver. Jason firmly believes he currently holds 100% undisputed legal ownership of those massive physical assets. Because he genuinely thinks he owns the machines free and clear of any oversight, he felt perfectly arrogantly confident, legally liquidating the main company accounts and carelessly wiring $8 million directly to that hidden offshore bank in the sunny Bahamas. Thomas looked at me with a grim expression, concluding that Jason is currently operating under the absolute unshakable certainty that you have absolutely no legal ground to stand on to stop him. Hearing his brilliant legal breakdown of Jason's arrogance, I let a slow, dark, and highly predatory smile spread completely across my weathered face. I calmly reached deep into my inner suit jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a small, incredibly worn leather notebook whose pages had yellowed with age. I carefully opened the fragile binding and looked directly into the sharp gray eyes of the most ruthless litigator in the entire city. Jason only knows exactly what I specifically allowed him to know. When I proudly handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer 3 short years ago, I explained, my voice steady and vibrating with hidden power. I told Thomas that Jason meticulously read the standard operating agreements and carefully reviewed the daily mundane operational ledgers. But Jason was only 8 years old when I formally, legally incorporated Gallagher Construction way back in the turbulent economic climate of 1985. Jason was absolutely not there when I sat down in a smoke-filled room with my original founding partners to carefully draft the absolute unalterable core bylaws of the entire corporation. I vividly remembered those early days. I inherently knew the commercial construction industry was heavily populated with ruthless thieving vultures, so I made absolutely sure to legally install a highly classified impenetrable safety mechanism at the very foundation of the company. It was a brilliant fail-safe mechanism that even the reigning chief executive officer absolutely cannot override or bypass under any circumstances. Thomas instantly leaned forward across the desk, his sharp gray eyes suddenly glowing with an intense, burning professional curiosity. He placed his large hands entirely flat on the polished table, giving me his complete, undivided, and absolute attention. "What exactly did you do, Vincent?" he asked in an urgent, hushed whisper, sensing the legal earthquake I was about to unleash. I gently placed the small, worn leather notebook directly on top of the pile of freshly forged documents. I explained that when I drafted the original Articles of Incorporation nearly 40 years ago, I deeply embedded a permanent founder's veto directly inside the dense corporate bylaws. It is legally structured as a highly restrictive golden share, and it has been safely, quietly held in an impenetrable blind trust for nearly 4 decades. I tapped the notebook and revealed that this highly specific ironclad legal clause explicitly states that any unauthorized transfer, massive sale, or total liquidation of corporate physical assets exceeding $100,000 requires significantly more than just a standard digital signature or a chief executive officer's rubber stamp approval. It legally undeniably requires my actual physical presence in the room, a specialized custom-made corporate seal, and my physically notarized fingerprint to be officially recognized as a legally valid transaction under strict federal law. Without that specific golden share authorization being physically executed, any major transfer of company property is completely, entirely, and retroactively void. The silence that rapidly descended upon the upscale, luxurious office was absolute and deafening. Thomas stared at me for a long, profound moment, his brilliant legal mind rapidly processing the sheer devastating magnitude of the trap I had just revealed. His sharp eyes darted wildly from my calm face down to the massive stack of forged asset transfer deeds, and then directly over to the printed pages of the offshore bank statements from the Bahamas. I quietly watched as the monumental realization slowly dawned on him. The sharp, incredibly predatory grin that Thomas was so famous for in the courtroom slowly, dramatically returned to his face, spreading wide and dangerous, like a starving wolf that had just brilliantly cornered its terrified prey. "Do you fully, completely understand exactly what you have just told me right now?" Vincent Thomas asked, his voice visibly vibrating with a highly dangerous, barely contained legal excitement. "Jason arrogantly forged your simple digital signature to seemingly sell $15 million worth of heavy lifting machinery to his wife's fake shell company. But because he absolutely did not have the physical golden share authorization required by the 1985 bylaws, that massive sale never legally happened on paper. Those massive yellow machines still belong entirely 100% to you, which legally means the staggering $8 million they aggressively extracted from the company, accounts, and immediately transferred to the Bahamas was absolutely not a legitimate authorized corporate dividend as they believed. It was, in the eyes of the law, raw stolen money." Thomas abruptly stood up from his leather chair and immediately began to pace the expansive length of his spacious corner office, his brilliant mind visibly working at lightning speed. He was clearly no longer just a civil lawyer quietly preparing a standard lawsuit. He was a five-star general actively mapping out a completely devastating scorched earth counterattack. This hidden golden share changes absolutely everything, he said, quickly turning back to face me with a look of lethal determination. He explained that if they had simply embezzled the money locally and hidden it in an Ohio bank, we would frustratingly have to drag them through years of incredibly tedious, drawn-out state civil litigation. But by arrogantly moving stolen, entirely unauthorized funds directly into a hidden offshore account located in the Bahamas, they have foolishly crossed a massive, entirely fatal legal line. They did not just steal from you, Vincent, Thomas declared, his voice booming with authority. By intentionally failing to report those stolen corporate assets and actively hiding them in a notorious international tax haven, they have actively, undeniably defrauded the Federal Internal Revenue Service. Sitting there, I physically felt the agonizing, suffocating heavy weight of the past 3 months finally begin to lift from my tired shoulders. The profound grief over losing my beloved wife was still a dull, persistent ache deep in my chest, but the overwhelming, paralyzing sense of absolute helplessness had been completely and totally eradicated from my system. My own son had looked me dead in the eye and callously lied about having the necessary funds to save his own mother's life. He had gleefully purchased massive luxury vehicles while intentionally, maliciously denying her basic human comfort in her final days. And now he was aggressively planning to chemically drug me and legally lock me inside a horrific state-run asylum just to permanently secure his stolen bloody wealth. He had carelessly thrown away his entire loving family for a quick $8 million payout, and now that very same stolen money was going to be the absolute, undeniable instrument of his own total destruction. I looked at Thomas and firmly stated that I want them to lose absolutely everything they have, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any remaining shred of paternal mercy or forgiveness. I demanded that I want their hidden offshore bank accounts permanently and irrevocably frozen by the government. I want my entire heavy machinery fleet legally and physically returned to my commercial yard. And I want them to finally, agonizingly realize that they have completely ruined their own lives strictly because they completely foolishly underestimated the man who built their very foundation. Thomas grinned exactly like a starving wolf, his sharp gray eyes gleaming with a pure, highly calculated malice. We will absolutely give them exactly what they truly deserve, he vehemently promised. They arrogantly thought they could quietly push you out of the picture. They thought they could cleanly steal your massive legacy and just walk away without suffering a single scratch. But they did not just steal from you, Vincent. By utilizing those hidden offshore accounts to stash stolen funds, they aggressively defrauded the IRS. We do not just sue them in civil court. We let the immense power of the federal government entirely destroy them. The drive back to my house was a masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. Thomas Reed had handed me the blueprint for absolute vengeance, but executing that plan required me to perform the most degrading role of my entire life. I had to walk back into the lion's den and convince the predators that I was nothing more than a helpless, broken old man. Gary dropped me off 2 blocks away from my property, so my son would not see his truck. The freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, damp fog hanging over the suburban streets. I walked slowly, intentionally, rolling my shoulders forward and shortening my stride. By the time I reached my front porch, I had completely shed the posture of a corporate chief executive officer. I let my hands develop a slight, continuous tremor. I forced my eyes to lose their sharp focus, adopting the hollow, vacant stare of a man whose mind was slowly slipping away into the darkness. I reached out with a shaking hand, fumbled deliberately with the doorknob, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The moment I stepped into the foyer, the tense, suffocating atmosphere in the house hit me like a physical wall. Jason and Natalie were aggressively pacing in the living room. The moment the front door clicked shut, they both snapped their heads toward me. Their faces were tight, with a mixture of sheer panic and intense irritation. They had clearly spent the last few hours terrified that their prize asset had wandered off and ruined their meticulously timed schedule. Jason stormed across the hardwood floor, his designer shoes clicking sharply. His face was flushed with anger, but he quickly forced his features into an exaggerated mask of parental concern. He grabbed me by the shoulders, his grip a little too tight, his fingers digging into my coat. "Dad. Where on earth have you been?" he demanded, his voice loud and condescending. "We have been looking everywhere for you. You cannot just wander off into the rain like this. You terrified us." I blinked up at him, letting my mouth hang slightly open. I forced a pathetic, trembling breath into my lungs. I reached up with my shaking hand and weakly grabbed his wrist. "I am sorry, Jason," I whispered, making my voice sound thin and extremely fragile. "I just went for a walk. I was trying to find the bakery. Your mother wanted those blueberry muffins she likes so much. I could not remember which street it was on. I just got a little turned around." Jason exchanged a victorious look with his wife. He actually believed it. He thought the grief had fractured my mind. He sighed and gently pushed me toward the sofa. Natalie stepped forward, her high heels silent on the rug. She gave me that sickly sweet, patronizing smile she had worn earlier. "It is okay, Dad," she cooed, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. "We know you are confused. You have had a hard day. Sit right here and rest your legs. I will make you something warm to drink." I slumped down onto the fabric, letting my chin drop. I stared at my trembling hands, maintaining the illusion, while my mind tracked her every movement. I listened closely to the sounds coming from the kitchen. I heard the clinking of porcelain mugs, the rush of the faucet, and the hum of the microwave. But I also heard the rustle of a plastic pill bottle being opened. The audio recordings explicitly outlined their method. They were dosing my drinks with liquid sedatives to guarantee I would fail the psychiatrist's cognitive evaluation the following morning. They needed me completely docile, unable to string a sentence together, so the state would officially strip away my rights. Natalie returned to the living room a few moments later. She held a steaming ceramic mug in both of her hands. The sweet herbal aroma of chamomile floated through the room, masking whatever heavy chemical tranquilizers she had just poured into the hot water. She knelt in front of the sofa, acting like an angel of mercy, and carefully pressed the warm mug into my shaking hands. "Drink this, Dad," she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "It is my special tea. It will help calm your nerves and give you a really deep, long sleep. You need your rest. The doctor is coming to the house tomorrow morning to help you feel better, and we want you to be completely relaxed for him." I looked down at the pale yellow liquid swirling inside the mug. I slowly raised it toward my lips, letting my hands tremble so violently that a few warm drops spilled over the edge and landed on my trousers. I took a very shallow fake sip, making sure not to swallow a single drop of the poisoned tea. I let out a long, ragged sigh, pretending the warmth was instantly soothing my fractured nerves. "Thank you, Natalie," I mumbled weakly. "You are so good to me. Both of you. I do not know what I would do without my family." Natalie smiled, a cold, triumphant gleam flashing in her dark eyes. Just then, Jason's cellular phone rang loudly from the kitchen counter. He cursed under his breath and turned away to answer it, motioning for Natalie to follow him and check the caller identification. It was the absolute perfect momentary distraction. The second their backs were turned, I leaned to my left. Sitting next to the sofa was a large, decorative potted fern that Barbara had meticulously cared for over the last decade. Without making a single sound, I quickly tipped the ceramic mug and poured the entire contents of the heavily drugged tea directly into the dark, thirsty soil. I placed the empty mug back onto my lap and closed my eyes, letting my head loll back against the cushions. When Natalie and Jason returned from the kitchen a minute later, I was perfectly still, mimicking the heavy, shallow breathing of a man rapidly slipping into a chemically induced coma. I heard Natalie chuckle softly. She reached out and plucked the empty mug from my relaxed fingers. "Look at him," she whispered to Jason, her voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. "He is completely out. The medication works incredibly fast. He will not remember his own name by the time the evaluator gets here tomorrow morning." Jason grunted in agreement. "Let us just get him out of the way for now," he said coldly. "Grab his other arm." Together, my son and his wife hauled me up from the sofa. I let my body go completely limp, forcing them to carry my dead weight down the hallway toward my bedroom. They tossed me carelessly onto the mattress, not even bothering to pull the blankets up over my shoulders. They turned off the overhead light and walked out of the room. I heard the door click shut, followed immediately by the sharp metallic sliding of the deadbolt locking from the outside. They had locked me inside. I lay perfectly still in the cold, dark room, silently waiting for the morning sun to rise above the trees. The digital clock on my nightstand slowly ticked away the final hours of my supposed freedom. Falling asleep was absolutely impossible for me under these conditions. My mind was a relentless machine running through every single calculation, every legal maneuver, and every piece of evidence Thomas Reed had prepared for this exact day. The Friday morning finally broke, casting a pale, gray light through the gaps in my bedroom blinds. I sat up on the edge of the mattress and listened to the familiar sounds of my house waking up. But today, the domestic noises were not comforting. They were the sounds of an execution squad preparing for their final act. Right around 8 o'clock, I heard the heavy rumble of a large diesel engine idling right outside my front window. I quietly slipped out of bed, walked over to the glass and peeled back a tiny corner of the blinds. Parked at the very end of my long driveway was a battered white transport van. The rusted logo painted on the side panel confirmed my darkest fears. It read Sunset Pines Memory Care Facility. The driver was sitting in the front seat smoking a cigarette and scrolling on his phone waiting for his human cargo to be delivered. The reality of what my son was attempting to do hit me once again, but this time there was zero trace of sorrow in my heart. There was only the cold, unyielding anticipation of the trap I was about to spring. I moved away from the window and pressed my ear against the heavy oak door of my bedroom. The heavy brass deadbolt was still firmly locked from the outside. I could hear Jason and Natalie moving around in the hallway and the living room. Their voices were not hushed or careful. They believed I was heavily sedated from the poisoned tea I had dumped into the plant the night before. They thought I was currently lying unconscious, drooling on my pillow, completely unaware that my life was being stolen. I clearly heard the unmistakable crinkle of a large plastic garbage bag being snapped open. Jason was loudly complaining to his wife about the smell of mothballs. He was rummaging through the hall closet, haphazardly tossing my oldest, cheapest flannel shirts and worn-out sweatpants into the plastic bag. He could not even give me the basic human dignity of packing a proper suitcase for the horrible asylum he was sending me to. From the kitchen, I heard Natalie humming a cheerful, upbeat melody. Her voice drifted down the corridor bright and full of genuine excitement. She was speaking loudly on her cellular phone. I pressed closer to the door, listening to her negotiate with a high-end real estate broker. She was officially listing my custom-built house on the market, demanding an expedited open house by Monday morning. She casually mentioned that the previous owner had experienced a tragic medical decline and would not be returning to the property. She was selling the beautiful home I had built for Barbara, the sacred home where we had raised our family together, to easily fund a lavish tropical vacation, all while the transport van idled in my driveway, waiting to permanently lock me away. The sheer sickening arrogance of their casual conversation was the absolute final catalyst I needed. I pushed myself away from the locked door and walked over to my master closet. It was time to shed the pathetic, fragile disguise I had worn the previous night. I quickly stripped off the rumpled cotton pajamas and took a long, hot shower, washing away the lingering exhaustion of the past 3 months. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and shaved with absolute precision, making sure every line of my face was sharp and composed. I walked back into my closet and reached for the garment bag hanging in the very back. Inside was a tailored dark charcoal suit made of premium Italian wool. It was the exact suit I wore when I negotiated multi-million-dollar construction contracts. I pulled the crisp, bright white dress shirt over my shoulders and buttoned it up, fastening a heavy silk tie around my neck. I stepped into my highly polished black leather Oxford shoes, tying the tight laces with firm, steady hands. I strapped my heavy steel chronograph watch to my wrist, feeling the familiar grounding weight of the metal against my skin. I ran a comb through my silver hair, smoothing every strand perfectly into place. I looked at my reflection one last time. The broken, grieving widower who had been bullied into submission was completely gone. Staring back at me was the ruthless chief executive officer who had built a massive industrial empire from nothing. I was finally completely ready. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I heard the heavy deadbolt on my bedroom door slide open, with a loud, sharp, metallic clack. The brass handle turned slowly. Jason pushed the door inward carelessly, carrying his black plastic garbage bag in one hand, completely expecting to find a heavily drugged, helpless old man blindly lying in the dark. I was standing in the very center of the room, illuminated by the bright morning light pouring through the open blinds. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at him, fully radiating the absolute terrifying authority of a man in total control of his domain. Jason froze perfectly still in the doorway. The plastic bag slipped from his fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a soft thud. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he took in my tailored suit, my polished shoes, and my razor-sharp posture. "Dad," he desperately stammered, his voice trembling heavily with a sudden, unexplainable fear. "Why are you dressed like that? The doctor is here to see you." I did not offer him any sort of an answer. I did not give him the satisfaction of an argument. I simply walked forward, forcing him to take a hurried step backward into the hallway to get out of my way. I marched past him with heavy, purposeful strides, moving directly toward the spacious living room. Natalie was sitting on the expensive leather sofa, holding a silver pen and smiling at a stack of real estate listing contracts. A strange man in a very cheap gray suit, securely carrying a medical clipboard, was standing nervously near the stone fireplace. The moment I walked into the room, Natalie dropped her pen. Her cheerful smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. I ignored both of them. I walked straight to my favorite brown leather armchair, sat down slowly and deliberately, picked up the black remote control from the side table, and turned on my large flat-screen television. The massive screen mounted above the stone fireplace flickered from deep black to stark, blinding white. The sudden burst of light changed the atmosphere in the spacious living room. Natalie let out a loud, theatrical sigh of irritation. She crossed her legs on the expensive leather sofa and shot a look of exasperation at the court-appointed psychiatrist. She silently mouthed the words, "He is always doing things like this," playing the exhausted caretaker to absolute perfection. Jason stood rigidly near the hallway entrance, his hands balled into tight fists. He took a cautious step forward, unnerved by my sudden change in demeanor and tailored suit, desperately trying to maintain his false authority. "Dad, turn the television off right now," Jason commanded. "We are not watching game shows today." I ignored his command. I sat in my brown leather armchair, crossing my left ankle over my right knee, and pulled my cellular phone from my suit jacket. With a few taps on the glass screen, I activated the wireless casting feature. A loading icon spun before the image abruptly shifted. The screen no longer showed morning news broadcasts. Instead, it displayed a high-definition live video feed. I had paid a private security firm an exorbitant amount of cash to covertly install hidden cameras inside that abandoned industrial warehouse last night. Now 4 camera angles filled the screen. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody in the room made a single sound. The corrupt doctor shifted his weight nervously, entirely unsure of how to proceed with a patient who was clearly not suffering from a sedative stupor. Jason narrowed his eyes, squinting at the television as he tried to make sense of the gritty industrial background displayed on the screen. Natalie was the very first person to recognize the location. I watched as the fake, compassionate smile completely melted right off her manicured face. Her breathing stopped entirely. She stared in pure shock at the familiar row of massive yellow excavators and heavy lifting cranes filling the bottom right quadrant. She could clearly see the black letters of her shell company painted across the stolen machinery. "What is this?" Jason muttered, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying whisper. He took another step toward the television, his eyes darting frantically between the 4 different camera angles. "How do you have this video feed on your phone? Where did you get this?" I did not answer him. I simply reached over to the small wooden side table, picked up my porcelain mug of hot black coffee, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I wanted them to experience every single second of their impending destruction without any distractions. On the top left quadrant of the television screen, the exterior camera captured a flurry of rapid, aggressive movement. 3 heavy black tactical vehicles, followed closely by a large armored command truck, came tearing down the narrow gravel road at high speed. They slammed on their brakes right in front of the rusted corrugated metal doors of the warehouse. Dust and loose gravel flew into the air. Before the vehicles had even come to a complete stop, the doors flew open. Over a dozen federal agents swarmed out into the bleak morning light, moving with the swift efficiency of a highly coordinated military strike. The bold, bright yellow letters printed across the back of their dark, tactical vests were clearly visible. Half of the team belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The other half proudly wore the insignia of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They were there to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar international fraud syndicate. Jason let out a strangled, breathless gasp. He stumbled backward, his designer shoes catching on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. He threw his hands out blindly, grabbing the edge of the dining table to keep from collapsing. The color drained from his face so quickly he looked like a walking corpse. He watched in absolute paralyzing horror as 2 heavily armored federal agents stepped up to the massive padlock securing the main warehouse entrance. One of the agents swung a heavy iron battering ram directly into the locking mechanism. The heavy steel gave way instantly. The interior camera feeds lit up with chaotic motion. The federal agents poured into the warehouse, spreading out across the concrete floor like a dark, relentless wave. Natalie let out a high-pitched, whimpering sob. She pressed both hands over her mouth in pure panic as she watched the destruction of her stolen empire unfold. A team of federal investigators marched toward the stolen construction equipment, pulling out diagnostic scanners to check the hidden serial numbers stamped into the heavy steel frames. But the absolute worst moment for them was yet to come. On the bottom left camera feed, the lead investigator directed a specialized tactical unit toward the locked modular office in the far corner of the warehouse. That was the room holding the gray filing cabinets, the double ledgers, and the offshore banking codes. Jason grabbed his own hair, completely unraveling right in front of me. No, you cannot do this," he stammered. The agents smashed the reinforced glass of the office window, reached inside, and unlocked the heavy security door. 4 investigators flooded into the cramped space. We watched them rip the computer monitors from the desk. They unhooked the master hard drives, sealing them inside thick federal evidence bags. Another agent grabbed a heavy crowbar and jammed it into the top drawer of the gray filing cabinet, pulling out the manila folders containing the forged asset transfer deeds and dummy vendor invoices that tied Jason directly to wire fraud. The court-appointed psychiatrist, who had been hired to evaluate my mental capacity and facilitate my forced imprisonment, slowly lowered his medical clipboard. He looked at the television screen, then looked at the 2 terrified people who had paid his cash retainer. He realized instantly that he had just walked directly into a massive federal criminal investigation. He took a very slow, cautious step backward toward the front hallway. Natalie began to violently shake. Her entire wealthy, arrogant facade had completely crumbled into dust. She slowly turned her head away from the television and looked directly at me. Her dark eyes were brimming with a mixture of absolute confusion, raw terror, and sudden realization. She was holding a ceramic mug of warm chamomile tea, the exact kind of poisoned beverage she had used to drug me the night before. Her fingers lost their grip. The heavy mug slipped from her hands and plummeted toward the ground. It hit the solid hardwood floor with a sharp crash. "What on earth is all that?" she stammered in absolute shock, her voice completely broken and hollow, barely a whisper in the tense, suffocating silence of the living room. I sat perfectly still in my leather armchair, silently basking in the glorious warm glow of absolute justice. I looked at her terrified, trembling face, then slowly raised my porcelain mug to my lips. I took a calm, deeply satisfying sip of my hot black coffee, savoring the rich, dark flavor. I lowered the mug and rested it on my knee. That, Natalie, is the exact sound of your glorious Hawaiian retirement permanently burning down to the ground. The massive living room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the chaotic shouting of federal agents echoing from the television. Natalie remained completely frozen, staring at the shattered ceramic pieces of her tea scattered across the floor. Jason leaned heavily against the dining table, gasping for air, as if the room had lost its oxygen. He looked totally broken, his arrogant posture dissolving into a cornered animal. But the corrupt psychiatrist had not yet grasped the magnitude of the trap that had snapped shut. He had been paid a massive cash retainer to perform a specific job, and he was desperate to earn his bribe. He tightened his grip on his clipboard and stepped forward, placing himself directly between me and the television. He puffed out his chest, trying to project absolute medical authority. "Mr. Gallagher," the doctor said, his voice artificially steady, "you are experiencing a severe paranoid delusion. This aggressive behavior and these hallucinations are classic symptoms of advanced cognitive decline." The doctor took a cautious step toward my armchair, raising his hand in a patronizing gesture. He looked over his shoulder, shooting an urgent glance at my son. "Jason, I need you to step forward and help me secure your father." The psychiatrist commanded, his tone dripping with false urgency. "We need to administer a heavy sedative before he becomes a danger to himself. I will sign the emergency psychiatric hold right now and transport him to the Sunset Pines facility." Jason did not move a muscle. He was paralyzed by his unfolding nightmare, staring blankly at the television, watching his stolen empire being dismantled by federal investigators. The doctor turned his attention back to me, reaching into the front pocket of his suit jacket. I could clearly see the outline of a plastic syringe case. He was preparing to chemically restrain me right there in my living room. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked the corrupt man dead in the eyes, allowing a cold smile to curve my mouth. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, doctor," I warned him quietly, my voice devoid of any fear. "I highly recommend you take your hand out of your pocket and step away before you destroy your life." The psychiatrist scoffed, shaking his head. "You are not in control here, Mr. Gallagher," he replied. "I am the medical professional assigned to this case, and I have the legal authority to declare you incompetent." He never got the chance to finish his arrogant sentence. The heavy front door suddenly swung open with a massive, deafening crash that shook the walls of the foyer. The sudden noise made the psychiatrist flinch, pulling his hand away from his pocket. Natalie let out a sharp, terrified shriek, scrambling backward until her spine hit the living room wall. Jason finally tore his eyes away from the screen, spinning around to face the entrance. Standing perfectly framed in the doorway was Thomas Reed. My lawyer looked like a modern executioner. He was wearing an immaculate pinstripe suit, his silver hair combed, and his gray eyes sweeping across the room with lethal precision. He did not look like a man coming to negotiate. He looked like a man coming to destroy everything in his path. Flanking Thomas on either side were two massive, heavily armed city detectives. Their gold police badges caught the morning light, reflecting a blinding glare. Their physical presence fundamentally altered the balance of power within the house. The detectives stepped into the foyer, their hands resting near their duty belts, taking total command of the entire space. The atmosphere shifted from manipulation to sheer panic. Thomas walked forward with powerful strides, his leather shoes echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. He completely ignored Jason and Natalie. He marched directly up to the psychiatrist, stopping less than 2 feet away from the trembling man. The doctor shrank backward, clutching his clipboard to his chest. "Who are you?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure of Thomas's intimidating presence. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? You have no legal right to interrupt a secure medical evaluation. Thomas did not say a single word. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. He held it out, pressing the heavy paper directly against the doctor's chest until the man had no choice but to instinctively raise his trembling hands and take it. "I am Thomas Reed," my lawyer spoke, his voice booming through the room with the crushing weight of a falling anvil. "I am the legal counsel for Mr. Vincent Gallagher, and I highly suggest you open that envelope before you make another empty threat." The psychiatrist fumbled with the clasp, his fingers shaking so badly he nearly dropped the package. He pulled out a crisp laboratory document bearing the official seal of a premier private clinic. He stared at the bold text, his eyes darting frantically across the medical terminology. His lips parted, but no sound escaped his throat. "That document," Thomas continued, his voice dripping with concentrated venom, "is a certified toxicology report. It proves beyond a shadow of a single doubt that your clients have been systematically poisoning Mr. Gallagher with unauthorized heavy liquid sedatives for the past 48 hours. You willingly participated in a malicious attempt to chemically imprison him." The doctor stopped breathing entirely. His face turned a sickening shade of green as he realized the magnitude of the trap he had just walked into. Thomas was not finished. He reached into his jacket one more time and pulled out a second document. He forcefully slapped the stiff paper onto the surface of the doctor's plastic clipboard. "And that second document," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper, "is a formal federal subpoena for your medical license, along with a direct warrant for your immediate arrest on charges of criminal medical malpractice, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and attempted medical extortion. You were hired to facilitate a multi-million-dollar fraud syndicate, and your entire career is officially over." The psychiatrist stared blindly at the terrifying legal documents resting in his shaking hands. The realization of his absolute ruin crashed down upon him. He looked at Jason, who was currently cowering near the dining table, unable to offer any protection. The doctor realized in that exact moment that the wealthy people who had promised him an easy cash payout were nothing more than cornered rats about to be slaughtered by a massive federal investigation. His survival instincts overpowered his greed. The psychiatrist let out a weak gasp. His fingers went completely numb. The metal clipboard slipped from his grasp, crashing loudly onto the floor and scattering his fraudulent evaluation forms across the expensive rug. He did not attempt to retrieve a single piece of paper. He immediately raised both of his hands high into the air, surrendering completely to the armed city detectives standing right behind Thomas. The corrupt doctor rapidly backed away from my leather armchair, shaking his head in total defeat, completely abandoning Jason and Natalie to face the devastating consequences of their own monstrous actions. The heavy thud of the metal clipboard hitting the floor seemed to break the spell of paralyzed terror holding my son hostage. The two armed city detectives stepped forward, their heavy boots moving in perfect synchronization as they positioned themselves between the front doorway and the center of the living room. They did not draw their weapons, but their physical presence was an overwhelming force of absolute authority. The corrupt psychiatrist had completely surrendered, pressing his back against the foyer wall with his hands raised high in the air. He was entirely broken, leaving Jason and Natalie exposed and utterly alone in the center of the room. The cold reality of the situation finally pierced through the thick layers of arrogance and greed. He looked at the detectives, then looked at Thomas Reed, and finally his desperate, terrified eyes locked onto me. The air in the room grew thick, smelling faintly of the poisoned chamomile tea Natalie had tried to force down my throat the night before. The live television broadcast behind me continued to show federal agents ripping his secret empire apart, piece by piece. "Dad, you have to stop this right now!" Jason screamed, his voice cracking with a pathetic, high-pitched panic. He threw his hands out in front of him, pleading with frantic energy. "This is a massive misunderstanding. You are not thinking clearly. Thomas is manipulating you. We were just trying to help you manage the estate because you have been so overwhelmed with grief since Mom passed away." The machinery transfer, the offshore accounts. It was all just a temporary protective measure to shield the family assets from corporate taxes. We were going to explain everything to you once the market stabilized. He was speaking so fast that his words blurred together desperately, trying to weave one final plausible lie to save himself from the federal prison sentence waiting for him. He thought the father who had protected him for 40 years would step in and call off the hounds to protect the family name. His pale face was covered in a slick sheen of cold sweat. I did not say a single word in response to his frantic lies. I placed my porcelain coffee mug onto the wooden side table with a soft, deliberate click. I placed my hands on the armrests of my leather chair and pushed myself up to a full standing position. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit and began to walk slowly across the living room floor. Every step I took was measured heavy and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I watched Jason shrink backward with every inch I gained. He bumped into the edge of the dining table, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He was no longer the arrogant chief executive officer who had mocked my grief. He was a terrified, cornered thief staring at the man who had built the very foundation he tried to steal. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him, invading his personal space, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. I refused to let him look away from the reckoning he had brought upon himself. The physical distance between us closed, but the emotional chasm separating father from son became an endless void. I reached inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket. My hand did not shake. My heart did not race. I pulled out the folded piece of thick paper that I had taken from the bright red medical file hidden inside his stolen warehouse. I slowly unfolded the document, smoothing out the creases, and held it up so the crisp black text was visible in the morning light. It was the official letter from the elite oncology center. It was the absolute proof of his monstrosity. Jason looked down at the hospital letterhead, and the last drop of blood drained from his face. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. His eyes darted to the bottom of the page, landing directly on the waiver form, bearing his own forged, callous signature. He knew exactly what paper I was holding. He knew I had uncovered the darkest, most evil secret he had ever buried. The financial theft was a crime against my business, but this piece of paper was a crime against my soul. It was the irrefutable evidence of his ultimate betrayal. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or scream in anger. I spoke to him with a terrifying, absolute quietness that seemed to suck all the remaining warmth out of the room. You sat on my sofa 3 months ago and cried tears of pure deception. I told him, my voice completely cold and hollow. You looked me dead in the eye and told me the commercial construction market had crashed. You told me the bank had repossessed our entire $15 million fleet and that the company was entirely bankrupt. You watched me agonize over losing the legacy I built for you. But the banks never took the company, Jason. You took it. You forged my signature, sold the heavy machinery to your wife for a single dollar, and hoarded over $8 million in stolen cash in the Bahamas. You sat across from me at the dinner table, pretending to be a broken son, while you secretly funneled my life savings into an international tax haven. You smiled in my face while secretly sharpening the knife to cut my throat. Your greed consumed every moral boundary you ever possessed. I stepped 1 inch closer, my voice dropping into a deadly razor-sharp whisper. But stealing my life's work was not your greatest crime. I tapped my index finger hard against the medical waiver he had signed. When your own mother needed you to save her life, when she was granted a genuine chance at remission through this experimental trial, you signed a piece of paper denying her treatment due to a lack of funds. You let the woman who gave you life suffocate in agonizing pain because paying for her medical care meant dipping into your stolen millions. You signed her death warrant on the exact day you purchased a $120,000 luxury sports utility vehicle for your wife. You traded your mother's heartbeat for shiny metal. The sheer agonizing weight of his exposed cruelty finally shattered him. Jason let out a wretched, suffocating sob, and his knees immediately buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing heavily at the very tips of my polished shoes, weeping uncontrollably as he finally realized the absolute irreversible magnitude of exactly what he had permanently lost. He had traded his entire family for an illusion of wealth that was currently being seized by federal agents. While my broken son sobbed on the floor in total defeat, my cold, unyielding eyes drifted past his trembling shoulders. Natalie had quietly slipped off her expensive high heels and was slowly, desperately inching her way backward down the long, dark hallway, frantically attempting to quietly sneak out the back door and completely disappear into the cold, dense morning fog. She did not make it far. Before her trembling hand could reach the polished brass handle of the heavy wooden door leading out to the back patio, a massive shadow detached itself from the dark corner of the hallway. It was the second city detective. He had silently positioned himself near the rear exit, the very moment he and his partner first stepped into the house, anticipating her cowardly attempt to flee the scene of her crimes. As Natalie lunged forward for the door, the detective moved with terrifying practiced speed. He reached out and caught her firmly by the upper arm, his large hand wrapping around her expensive silk sleeve like a vise of solid iron. Natalie let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed violently against the long corridor walls. The perfectly curated, arrogant facade of a wealthy, untouchable socialite shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the blink of an eye. She began to thrash wildly, violently kicking her bare feet against the polished hardwood floor and twisting her shoulders in a desperate, animalistic frenzy to break free from his unyielding iron grip. She screamed that she was completely innocent, that she had absolutely no idea what her husband was doing, and that she was merely a naive victim of his complex corporate manipulations. She was perfectly willing to throw the man she married directly under the bus to save her own skin, proving once and for all the absolute, bottomless depth of her selfishness. The veteran detective remained completely unfazed by her violent, dramatic tantrum. He effortlessly spun her around, forcing her wrists behind her back with a smooth, fluid motion. The sharp, heavy click of solid steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly shut echoed loudly through the silent hallway. The terrifying sound of the locking metal seemed to finally pull Jason out of his weeping, pathetic stupor on the living room floor. He slowly lifted his heavy head, his eyes painfully red and swollen from crying, just in time to watch the first armed detective march aggressively across the spacious room toward him. Jason did not attempt to fight back. He did not kick or scream like his hysterical wife. He simply raised his trembling hands into the air, completely devoid of any remaining fight, pride, or human dignity. The tall detective grabbed him forcefully by the collar of his tailored designer dress shirt, hauling him roughly to his feet in one swift motion, and pushed him face first against the polished wooden surface of the large dining table. The second pair of cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply shut around Jason's wrists, binding him just as securely as his treacherous wife. I stood perfectly still in the very center of the living room, quietly watching the two terrible people who had cruelly plotted to steal my life and lock me inside a horrific asylum, now officially reduced to restrained, weeping prisoners inside my own home. They had aggressively tried to strip me of my personal freedom, and now they had permanently forfeited their own. Natalie was forcefully dragged back into the main living room by the second detective, her expensive mascara running down her pale cheeks in thick, dark, messy streaks, completely ruining her previously flawless appearance. She looked directly at Jason with pure, unfiltered hatred, sobbing loudly and aggressively, cursing him for getting them both caught in such a catastrophic trap. Jason kept his head bowed low, utterly unable to meet her furious gaze and absolutely unable to look at me, completely crushed under the unbearable weight of his own truly monstrous failures. Thomas Reed stepped confidently forward, his highly polished leather shoes clicking sharply on the solid hardwood floor. He calmly buttoned the center button of his immaculate pinstripe suit, looking down at the two restrained criminals with a terrifying expression of absolute freezing, professional contempt. He proudly held up a thick manila folder, tapping it methodically against the flat palm of his hand. You both seem to be operating under the foolish, naive assumption that you will somehow be able to easily post a large cash bail and hire a massive criminal defense team. By this afternoon, Thomas said, his voice ringing out through the quiet room with deadly cutting authority. Let me quickly disabuse you of that incredibly comforting fantasy right now. When you two deliberately bypassed the domestic banking system and willfully used fraudulent corporate wires to secretly transfer $8 million into a hidden offshore account located in the Bahamas, you immediately escalated this from a simple state-level embezzlement case into a massive multi-layered federal crime. You actively and purposefully defrauded the Internal Revenue Service, and the federal government simply does not take kindly to massive international money laundering operations. Thomas smiled warmly, flashing a cold, predatory grimace that offered absolutely zero mercy or compassion to the weeping couple. As we currently speak, a strict federal judge has officially authorized the immediate total freezing of every single financial asset legally tied to your names. Your personal checking accounts, your lucrative joint savings, your diverse investment portfolios, and your open credit lines have all been aggressively locked down by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have absolutely no money left for bail. You have no money to hire an expensive criminal defense lawyer. You are completely and entirely bankrupt, exactly as you falsely claimed your father's company was. The devastating reality of their financial ruin crashed down upon them like a physical blow. Natalie let out a hollow wail, her knees instantly buckling as she realized she was going to rot in a federal holding cell without a single cent to her name. The two detectives hauled them upright, gripping their arms tightly to prevent them from collapsing onto the living room rug. Time to go, the lead detective announced, his voice devoid of human sympathy. He pushed a broken Jason toward the open front door, while his partner dragged a sobbing Natalie right behind them. I followed them into the foyer, stepping out onto the front porch to witness the final act of my carefully orchestrated vengeance. The morning fog had begun to lift from the suburban streets, and the loud commotion inside my house had not gone unnoticed. Several neighbors had stepped out onto their manicured lawns, standing silently on their porches with crossed arms, watching the dramatic spectacle unfold. They watched in stunned silence as the arrogant couple who had paraded around the neighborhood in luxury vehicles was marched down the driveway in heavy steel handcuffs. Jason kept his chin tucked tightly against his chest, humiliated, trying desperately to hide his weeping face from the judging eyes of the community. Natalie continued to weep loudly, her bare feet stumbling over the cold concrete of the driveway as she was shoved into the back seat of a waiting police cruiser. The heavy metal doors of the vehicle slammed shut, with a deafening thud securely sealing them inside a dark, inescapable cage. I stood tall on my front porch, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air, watching the flashing police sirens slowly pull away and disappear down the quiet street, leaving me perfectly alone and entirely free. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and old age does not equate to weakness. We spend our entire lives sacrificing our bodies and minds to build safe empires for our children, assuming they will protect us in our twilight years. But greed can turn the people you raised into absolute strangers who view your existence merely as an obstacle to their unearned inheritance. You must never surrender your independence blindly, and you must always keep a careful eye on the details. The greatest strength a father can possess is the unwavering willingness to burn his own empire down to crush betrayal. Did my story resonate with you? Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member completely out of your life to protect your own peace? Share your personal experiences in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible life stories.